Welcome to Staffing Structures and Hiring. My name is Kate Hersey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Tool Library. I'm happy to join you today. Here at the Minnesota Tool Library, we've been around for a little over 10 years, and we've had paid staff for the last 7 or 8 of those. So we started with a single half-time staff member and then added about another 1/3 of the time position as we expanded our operations. Then we divided all of those half-time roles out into smaller part-time positions. We have hosted various 1099 contractors, paid internships, national service volunteers, and most recently, we added programming and admin support staff. So together, we currently have a total of 9 paid staff members at the Minnesota Tool Library, which average roughly 2 full-time equivalent. So I'm really happy to talk staffing with you today. And while I do have a background in nonprofit management, including general HR, I'd like to be clear that I am in no way a certified HR professional. So the first question, of course, the burning question, do we need paid staff? So short answer, no. If you have a solid volunteer leadership team, you have enough capacity to support your operations, to fulfill your mission, you're good to go. As you can see from the Shareable lot report, it's quite common not to have any paid staff. So 47% of the tool libraries function right now without paid employees. However, if your to-do list is growing faster than your volunteer pool, you're missing core skills within your team, or your organization just generally needs greater stability to successfully function or to expand, it might be time to consider paid staff, right? So let's kind of dig into why we might have some paid staffing. So first and foremost, volunteer capacity, right? It ebbs and it flows. We all ride that volunteer wave, but some waters are livelier than others. So who's here heard of the 7-year itch? Well, volunteer relationships have that same phenomenon, but for them, it's generally between the 3 to 5 year mark, right? And that's when initial volunteer support tends to calm. Core leaders start to get burnt out, right? You're no longer in that really exciting startup phase. So paid staff can help support your volunteers and provide that balance. They can help keep your org from a proverbial wipeout. Who's had to scramble when they've had organizational knowledge lost, right? When a leader has left? Something that falls through the cracks because it wasn't clear who was responsible for filing that 990, right? Or where your IRS determination, paperwork ended up living, right? So paid staff can provide a clear and consistent go-to and ease those transitions. Then there are the dirty jobs, right? We've all got them. The tasks that no one wants to volunteer for because they're boring or dirty or otherwise unsexy, right? So paid staff can do those chores that make the work seem like work. Paid staff can also help build equity within your leadership. So many of us have been blessed to dedicate our time and our talents and even gift financial support and resources to our causes, but labors of love are still require labor, right? Not everyone in our community can afford to donate their time and talents. So providing paid positions can really help ensure that everyone has a seat at the table. Lastly, and I specifically mention it last because it should not be a priority consideration that's driving your staffing journey. And that's a big kind of no-no that I've seen in the nonprofit sector in particular. But paid staff can be a precondition to compete for particular grants and contracts. So especially at the municipal, state, and federal level, and from some of those larger private foundations, right? They will give a lot of lip service to volunteers, but when it comes down to signing a contract, they want a paid staff member at the other end of that pen. All right. So does that all make sense to people? We know why we're looking at staffing. All right. So now we're going to get into the nitty gritty. So really looking in detail at staff positions and at staff structure. So based on Tool Library Alliance survey data, there are 8 pretty common staff roles that we gravitate to. So, and I want to be clear that each of these is implemented in a variety of ways and timelines based on the library, right? So there is no one route to go here. There is no, this position should always be full-time or part-time, but we're going to give you what's most common and what seems to have worked well. So the 2 most common and often the first roles that are implemented as organizations grow are that of either an ED, an executive director, and or some variation of a branch manager, right? Head librarian, ops coordinator, branch manager, tool library coordinator. There are 1,000 different titles, but the core role remains the same. Organizations that go the ED route are generally looking for a head of operations with nonprofit management background, someone who can file that 990, help ensure compliance, help with fundraising, HR, PR, and a bit of everything else, especially if that staff is limited. They are generally salaried positions. And they are generally at least half-time roles, right? If the daily ops of opening the doors, processing loans, and engaging your membership, plus all the back-end admin that requires is more of a priority, then the initial position is usually that branch manager role. Right? I like to say that as an ED, my job half the time is herding cats, right? It's making sure everyone's moving in the same direction. So often these roles in particular can grow out of a need or a desire to compensate our founders or leaders of an organization. And one thing I want to note here is just keep in mind that when your organization starts to hire any paid staff, the existing leaders may not be the best candidate, right? And in fact, your board would not be doing their due diligence if they automatically hired whomever was currently at the helm. So this is something especially to think of if you're looking at maybe that founder coming into that role of an executive director. That's what we had at the Tool Library initially. And very soon it was very clear that was not a good fit, right? The skill sets did not match what the organization needed. And we had to kind of retool and find a different role. Another thing to note that if you yourself as a leader are in the running for a paid position, you should not be part of the hiring and review committee. And it happens way too often, especially in small nonprofits. You'd be amazed, but nope. The moment you say, I want to be looked at for this position, please consider me, you got to take yourself out of the room. Once you have paid staff, generally those paid staff are going to take on the daily operations while your board is the one who remains responsible for the strategic direction of the organization. All right. With small orgs, it gets a bit muddy. So especially if this is your first foray into hiring, it's not going to be a beautiful hierarchical structure, right? It's gonna get messy, and know that. So make sure you spend some time thinking about that transition and how to delineate the ownership of those governance tasks. The more staff you have, the more specialized roles will be. But obviously, when you're starting out and you're very small and you only have 1 or 2 staff members and they're only part-time and you're still relying on a huge volunteer crew to do kind of the bread and butter of your operations, right? Those roles are going to get a little bit muddy. The other position that is most common is some type of programming coordinator. So especially with an organization that is running classes, the programming coordinator role can be kind of an overarching, I'm in charge of scheduling and managing all the activities that the library hosts, right? Or it could be very specifically just looking at educational classes, or very specifically just looking at repair clinics, or just specifically looking at a bike share program that you're running, right? So it has a variety. Programming coordinator positions are often part-time. A lot of times they are contracted 1099 positions, especially if they're grant funded. They do lend themselves well to underwriting with grants. So that's the one nice thing about program coordinator positions. They can be short-term or long-term, just depending on kind of how you built that out. And a lot of the issues that people have when we're looking at a program coordinator position is oftentimes they'll start with something that's grant funded, it's short term, I have the money now, but then that grant goes away in a year and I have to figure out, okay, what am I doing with this staff member, right? And if you really love that staff member and you want to keep them on, you have to have a transition plan. A lot of us also pay instructors and teachers. Those are almost always 1099 contracts because it's up to the teacher just to decide what they're going to teach and when they're going to do it and how often they're going to do it, right? And for a lot of us, we're not doing so much programming that half the time we don't even have to fill out reporting, right? Because they're not going to get up to that $600 threshold for us. So that's handy. The other common staff roles that we have are development. So that is a role that is in charge of fundraising and grants, trying to figure out kind of how we're supporting your library. Those are often part-time. They are often contracted. They should not be done on commission. That is a no-no. So if you're thinking of hiring someone who's doing grant writing for you on a commission basis, nope. We have volunteer coordinators, pretty self-explanatory. For most of us, that's part-time. Often volunteer coordination duties are also tied in with other like programmatic roles. We have some option of a marketing or communications or engagement professional, right? So for most of our tool libraries have membership based. So a lot of times that will include member management and communications and outreach, in addition to staffing, booths and tables at your county fair and doing all your social media and your graphic design and whatnot. Marketing and communications works very well part-time. It also is one of those pieces that can work really well as kind of an intern or a work study position. And then the other kind of role that we often don't think about, but a lot of us have, is actually a third-party administrator position. And for most of us, that's our accountant, right? That's kind of our number one TPA person. But your contracted third-party administrators are kind of that other staff role that we have there. And so we have a full kind of tool library member snapshot here. You'll see the number of kind of executive director positions, program coordinators, volunteer coordinators, tool librarian managers, community engagement people, workshop instructors. You can get a little feel for kind of where people are in their full-time, part-time journey. The type of paid staffing that you implement should really be based on three core facets, right? The first thing that's going to dictate whether you are hiring someone as a contractor, whether you are doing a standard salaried position, or whether you're going to be doing a stipend or something like that, is the type of role and the job duties very specifically. The program proper classification link that's right in here will bring you to a lovely document that tells you exactly what needs to be applied for someone to legally be a 1099 contractor. You do not want to play fast and loose with those rules. All right. So you really want to make sure your decision is based, again, first on the type of role and the job duties, then on the term length, what's the tenure of that position, and then lastly, but not least, based on budget. And the big issue that a lot of people have is that generally they start with their budget and go, okay, what's the cheapest way to do this instead of starting at what's the best fit. You have 1099 contractors, right? These are independent contractors. There is no tax withholding that you have to manage as an organization. That is up to the individual contractor to set aside their taxes for the year. So for you as an organization, it's much easier. Generally speaking, your role is to create a contract and get it signed, right? You have to get a W-9 from that individual at the end of the year. If they have made over $600 gross, then you have to also file a 1099, usually miscellaneous for all of us, to let the government know how much they have made, and so that their reporting that they're doing matches kind of your output, right? That's the version of the W-2. So if you're not familiar with that, you should always get a W-9 on the front end from every contractor you're working with, even if you do not have to file that 1099 at the end of the year because they are underneath that core level. All right. And there is another great link here. If you're looking at going the 1099 route, Indeed actually has a really great, very easy to follow. Here's how you hire a 1099 contractor lead. So I want you to be aware of that. Then when we're hiring internally, right, we have part-time and full-time positions. Generally speaking, for both of these, you're going to make an offer. You're going to have to get a W-2 from your employee. You're going to have to fill out an I-9 from them, right? You're going to have to be able to verify that they are legally allowed to work in the U.S. That also means you have to have a spot to keep confidential records and paperwork. So make sure you've thought about where that's going and it's not, in your drawer. You're not putting it on a Google Drive. That's the little things like that that'll catch people. You as an organization are responsible for managing that tax withholding. You are, if you're in the United States, responsible for unemployment insurance. It is required in just about every single state, right? You are also going to have to be responsible for staying atop of both federal and state mandates, which are going to apply to your employees. Those mandates are going to be based on the number of employees you have. Sometimes it is based on full-time equivalents. Sometimes it's just based on the core number of people you have, right? But those will dictate whether or not you have to provide fringe benefits like health insurance, right? Do they qualify under the ACA? A lot of states now are starting to have retirement plan mandates or PTO, earned sick and safe time, right? Different leave requirements. So you have to make sure they're all there. It's a lot to keep up on. And I don't know about other states, but Minnesota is not terribly great at giving you kind of the heads up when they pass new legislation. So it's really important if you don't have someone else who's helping manage that that you're going to have to be able to stay on top of it, right? And bring it to your board and go, oh, wait, now we have to do this, and we're going to have to comply this year, next year at X level, and are on top of those pieces. A part-time employee is generally considered anything under 30 hours a week, based on the ACA guidelines. Part-time employees generally have limited or no benefits, but part-time positions are great for organizations like ours who are generally only open part-time, right? We're not generally doing the 9 to 5, 5 days a week. For many of us, our organizations are open to the public 5-10 hours a week, maybe, right? So a part-time employee is a great option for that. It's great for gig workers. It's great for kind of the underemployed. It's great for getting semi-retired workers back into your organization. So it works really well there. Full-time, generally over 30 hours a week, right? If you're offering a full-time position, you're not likely going to be able to fill it unless you're also offering benefits. And then when you're looking at a full-time position, you also have to consider whether it can be a non-exempt position where they will receive overtime or additional hours above that 40 that they're working, or if it's an exempt position. And each state's labor laws are a little bit different on that. So you always have to look at your state's labor laws. And there is a great resource here as well, just in terms of, at least in Minnesota, I'm assuming a nonprofit council in most other states, or these steps are also very applicable. If you're hiring your very first employee, this link here to the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits website has a great step-by-step, here are the 7-8 things that you need to make sure that you go ahead and do right away. All right. The other kind of 2 pieces that you have are third-party administrators, right? Those are contracted services, often accounting, your IT, your payroll, your HR, right? But those are generally paid for through a monthly or an annual fee. Those are longer term roles. They're ongoing tasks, right? You are not likely to 1099 an accountant unless you're doing it for like a single short-term audit project, right? When you need someone to run a payroll for you regularly or code your books every month, right? So those are generally your third-party administrators, where you're benefiting from that other organization's internal expertise. Then we have interns and work study students. Short term, today we're talking paid staff, so we're not talking about unpaid interns or work studies, right? These positions are often paid on a stipend rate, right, versus a full hourly rate. They can be underwritten by the school or by different partnerships. Here in Minnesota, both of our core cities in the Twin Cities have summer internship programs, right, where you can be a host site and the city is actually paying the intern. So that doesn't come out of our budget. We just have to host them. It does cost us some admin time in hosting them, right? We have to consider that in what we're getting, but we're not paying their $13.50 hourly rate, right? Or whatever it is. So depending on what you have locally, that's also a really great way to test out positions you might want to make full-time positions in the long term, right? It's a good way to kind of test out and go, okay, what does this job consist of? What would it be, right? Your interns or your work studies students should never replace a position, but they can help you grow into that position. So now let's look at what's in your wallet, right? This is our next big piece here. And setting your budget for the nitty-gritty of how we're going to budget it out and what's it really going to cost you. Right. So according to the Small Business Administration, which most of us fall under those small business guidelines, right? An employee typically is going to cost 1.25 to 1.4 times their salary. All right. So an employee that's paid a $40,000 salary is going to cost $50,000 to $56,000 to your bottom line. Right? So it adds up and it adds up quickly. Before hiring your first employee or adding to your staff, you really need to understand those true costs, right? So there are a lot of different budget considerations, right? First, what's your salary? What are we going to set our salary as? You need to be aware of what your local minimum wage is, right? And also, I think for most of us, we want to be cognizant of what's a fair wage, because it's not generally our minimum wage, right? So looking at that position, looking at the experience level of the individual you are hoping to employ, looking at your local market rates, try to find out, what realistically you can do. I know for us, the hardest part, right, for a tool librarian, there's so many different skill sets that we needed for a branch manager. That is not an entry-level position. As much as we would love it to be, the realization is that person has a lot of knowledge coming to the table. And we needed that knowledge, but we couldn't do it in a full-time role. Right? We could not afford that amount of knowledge. And so we turned that into a tiny part-time role. So it was really easy for people to do when they were semi-retired, because that way we could get them, and they were happy to do 5 hours to 10 hours a week, but they didn't get burnt out in their retirement on a half-time position, right? We divided it out. So thinking about setting your salary, you have to also think about what is your local employment law, right? Legally, you need to be able to give an employee a break after 4 hours, right? So if you're open for 6 hours, right? If you're a 6-hour time span, how are you going to ensure that your staff member gets their legal 15-minute break? We set our open hours to 3-hour to 4-hour time blocks. So we know they can close the doors for a half an hour, right? So you have to think through those things. Are you going to be paying overtime? Are you going to use any type of commission-based salary or bonus? Are you going to use just general bonuses, right? If you have money at the end of your year, are you paying that back out to your staff because it was a really good year? And how are you doing that? What's that going to look like? Remember that when you have those bonuses or those commissions, right, those are going to be taxable income. You also want to think about planning for those wage increases. Today, I'm offering this role at $15 an hour, but our role for a branch manager has gone up $5 in the last 3 years, I want to say, right? So you have to plan for those wage increases for the cost of living and helping your crew fight inflation on a regular basis. You have to plan for payroll taxes, and this is the huge one that gets a lot of people because they don't think of all these different payroll taxes, right? We see it coming out of our check and we just go, la, 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 la. But unless you're running payroll, you're not thinking about what you're taking out, right? So, FICA, FUTA, and SUTA, all the acronyms coming at you. So FICA is Social Security and Medicaid, Medicare taxes. Generally, your FICA tax rate is 7.65%. And so you have to withhold that additional percentage from the employee's wages. FUTA is the federal unemployment tax. It's 6% on the first $7,000 that an employee earns. Most employers receive a lovely tax credit, which is great. But if you're a nonprofit, you're not going to see that tax credit. So it's all, it's all going away for you. And then SUTA is the state unemployment tax. That's going to vary based on your state, and each state will set a rate to the employers, and it's going to be based on your industry. It's going to be based on your past claims. And then the wage base varies. So like every year I get an email from our state Department of Labor that says, hey, this is your base rate this year, and this is what it's going to be. And if you want to fight it, you can. But generally speaking, you're going to get that piece. So those are payroll taxes. For most of us, you're going to have that unemployment insurance. One thing I want to note is that there are a number of great options for nonprofit group trusts, where basically you can pay that unemployment fee into a trust instead of paying it as kind of a standard insurance. And then based on your claims, a lot of times you'll retain a portion of that kind of premium that would otherwise just be lost. So that's a really great option if you're in the nonprofit sector, to take a good look at that. Workers' comp. Well, I'm sure we're all very safety conscious, right? Many lots have the benefit of flying under OSHA's radar. So note that paid staff means OSHA regulations apply, at least for your staff. So that can require additional training. It can require additional financial investment to be in compliance. So it's something you also want to consider when you're going into that paid staff route. And that would apply both generally to 1099 contractors and to internal staff. So just know you don't get to bypass that one if someone's on a 1099. Although they have more responsibility for it. Then we have all your benefits, right? Health, retirement, disability, your PTO. Again, remember those federal and state mandates. Sometimes those are now being kind of rolled into additional state payroll taxes, so paid family and medical leave premiums, all of that kind of jazz. So very much it will depend on where you are. And then your payroll service, right? So a lot of people use and outsource their payroll service. We do. We use iComp. If you're digging a little bit deeper, right? What is it going to cost you to post your position? What about paid time to interview and make your selection? Administer that annual HR. Are you going to offer professional development opportunities? And that can be something as simple as, first aid training, right? You want to make sure every one of your staff members have first aid training. Have you budgeted for that? Do you have office space and office supplies? Are you going to need more physical space for a paid staff member who's living there and not a volunteer who's popping in for a few hours? Is it a shared or is it a communal space? How are you going to manage that? Are you going to have travel expenses you're going to have to deal with? Right? Do you have parking on site? If you're in a city, do you have to deal with paid parking? Do you have remote work expenses, which is something that a lot of us are thinking about, right? Are you going to provide a stipend to your staff members for them having internet service at home while they're working, right? For their computer, are you providing them a stipend for that technology that they need to use, or providing them extra, is it a tool library cell phone? Are you giving them $50 for using their personal cell phone a month? How is that working? And are you going to do that with a set stipend, right? Where it's a fringe benefit, you're paying it out kind of at a flat rate. That's going to be taxed. Or are you doing it on a reimbursement rate? A little bit more in your employees' hands if you do it on a reimbursement rate. Do you have uniforms, right? Are you going to provide and or go through more coffee and snacks at the library because you have paid staff who are there, right? Those little things really add up. So if you can think of all of those pieces, it'll give you a much more realistic look at what your budget is. So to see that, what all those different components look like. In this example, I have our fictional tool librarian, Libby, right? She earns $40,000 a year at a $25 an hourly rate. That's roughly 1,600 hours, like a third, 3/4 of a time rule. So just to give you kind of a little perspective. And here's how we get those numbers. The employer portion of the FICA tax is $3,060. Right? And that's 40,000 times 7.65. FUTA, 7,000 times 6%, 420. The workers' comp is 400, and that's using an estimate of $1 for every $100 in payroll. SUTA 189, 2.7% times 7,000. In this example, I used Florida's SUTA tax rate of 2.7%, right? For health insurance, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, the annual employer contribution for all health plans is roughly $6,440 for single coverage, right? Retirement plan, in this example, we have a $1,200 employer match, that's 3%. We have an employee 2% bonus, which is $800. We've got $200 in uniforms for the year, which is, I think, more than any of us would officially spend on Tool Library swag for our staff. But something as, innocuous as coffee. So 2 cups of coffee a day in the office, which would cost 50 cents a cup for 260 workdays for a total of $260, right? So $40,000 per year. Still going to cost us an extra just shy of 13,000 when we add up those above expenses. So I think it's helpful to kind of think of this. Obviously, you don't have to include uniforms. You don't have to include coffee. If you're not offering those fringe benefits, it'll go down a significant amount. But it's a great thing that I think we should all strive towards in our budgeting, is building out especially those benefits that we want to provide, even if we can't. And one thing that I'll always say is that your staffing structure should not be static, right? It should always be growing. You should always be reviewing it. Toss money away. Create an ops reserve for yourself so that when you're ready and when you get staff who you love and who want to stay but are telling you, hey, I really need help being able to pay for health insurance, you have the ability to do that, right? And keep your people happy and together. So what are the next core steps here? When we look at kind of how we go about hiring, there are a lot of different things that have to happen. And a lot of times we forget some of these core steps. So these are my core steps. First, you need to create the position, right? You need to do your research. You need to build a beautiful position description and a posting. And you need to be realistic when you're doing it, right? We are DIYers, our imaginations run wild with what we could have people do all the time, right? Our strategic plan is like the most beautiful wish list. And I always remind people that if we just move the needle a little bit further on here, we're successful, right? We're not trying to do it all. We can't feasibly do it all right away. And you need to be really careful, especially in your position descriptions, that you're not adding the kitchen sink, right? That those other duties as assigned are not a mile long, where you're going to burn out your staff and it's just not going to be sustainable for you. So we've got to create those positions. We have to set our budget, our realistic budget, and we have to secure it, right? We have to have the money in the bank. If your position is underwritten by grant funding, right? A lot of times you are going to have to pay out your payroll before you get that reimbursable grant back, right? There are going to be outlays. The timing is not always going to be there. You need to make sure that you can make payroll. As a general rule of thumb, I like to have 6 months of payroll stocked up. That's my minimum, which is a lot larger than a lot of other nonprofit organizations. But I would personally not feel comfortable hiring someone on unless I knew I've got an extra 6 months of this payroll ready to go before someone is in the door, right? You need to have all your ducks in a row, and there are lots of ducks, right? You need to have your payroll worked out, whether you're doing that in-house or through a third party. You need to have your insurance all set and up to date. You need to have your benefits packages all set and up to date, and an administrator for those as needed, right? All those TPAs have to be ready to go. You need to have a staff handbook, right? Something as we do it for our volunteers, you need one for your staff too. It is different. You need to have an onboarding and training plan. You need to have secure storage because there is confidential data once you have staff members that you don't have to deal with volunteers. And so you need secure storage all prepped for that, right? You need to create a hiring committee. You need to have interview questions, and you need to have a rubric. Because when you are hiring people, you have to ask the same questions of every applicant. You cannot go rogue, right? You need to make sure that your interview questions do not go against fair labor laws, right? There are many things you cannot ask people. You cannot ask people if they're planning on starting a family. You cannot ask them about any of their core demographic information. They can tell you that, and if they do, you can write it down, but you may not ask it. It cannot be part of your decision-making process. And if you're unsure what you can and cannot ask, there are tons of resources out there, but make sure you have good questions. Make sure you have a good rubric, right? How are you ranking all of these applicants on whether or not they're a good fit for your organization? And are you ranking them the same, right? No matter who is doing the hiring, does everybody have the same kind of input, right? Where are you posting your position? Are you hiring a company who's going to do an ED search for you, an executive search for you? Are you hiring a search firm? Are you posting to Indeed? Are they paid postings? Are you doing free postings in your local community, right? Does where you're posting hit the type of people you want to have as applicants and also hit any of your other equity goals, right? Are you getting it out more broadly? Then you're going to do your interviews. Then eventually, right, you're going to make offers. And I know offers because I cannot tell you how many people have sent, oops, sorry, you didn't get the job notices and we're ready to go on their first candidate. And then their first candidate ended up taking another job, right? You have to have your backups all ready to go. You need to have your offer letters. You have to do follow-up with those people as you're going through. And not only the individuals who you want to engage in your organization, but you need to make sure you're closing the loop and thanking every applicant that applies, right? And inviting them to volunteer with your organization or get involved in another way if they're not a good fit for that position. Are you keeping applications on file for the future? Or is it a one and a done? Then once you have that person, you're going to have to look at doing your background checks and doing all your paperwork, right? Doing your hiring paperwork. You're going to have to do your actual orientation and training. I always recommend you do a 30, 60, 90. That is 30 days in. You've been here a month. Here's what we've learned. Here's what our pinch points are. Same thing at 60 days and 90 days. That's that ongoing kind of onboarding piece that goes beyond that first day where we give you the handbook and we might show you how to use My Turn, right? You need ongoing support with all your staff. You should be doing some type of annual review every year with your staff, and it doesn't have to be intensive, but there should be a heavy check-in at least once a year, right? So you can make sure you're meeting those goals set in your job description, so that you can also at that point make any modifications you need to wages, to fringe benefits. You can see what's going well. And so you can make sure that you have everything in order to do those annual filings, right? So it'll be the back half of the W-2 for any kind of internal staff. It'll be the 1099 for any contracted staff, right? And then for your third-party administrators, it'll be making sure they have all the updated info and any audit information they need. It might be reviewing whether or not they're a good service provider for you still, right? And then for interns, generally, you know, it's your exit interview and whatever you might need to fill out for their school. You're going to look at kind of regular modifications to the positions and making sure you're going in and noting when you are giving people raises, when you're changing the amount of hours they're working, right? What's realistic? Eventually, staff are going to leave, right? I would love it if we could keep everyone forever, but that's just not the case. So when you get to that point, you have to worry about doing your exit interviews and then ongoing kind of reflection and adjustments. All right. So I have shoved a ton of information out at you. So now is your time to be able to ask questions.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about managing the dynamics and expectations for when the relationship between a previously all volunteer board managing a library of things and then adding that now one person potentially, you know, you give your
Yeah.
first hire. So now one person's getting paid and everybody else who may be working just as hard but on different hours with slightly different responsibilities are not getting paid. And if there's some friction points, some advice, yeah.
Friction, tension. Yeah. So a lot of that tends to depend on whether or not you're hiring from within, right? And if you're moving up someone who is internal to the organization already, right? So if you're hiring from within, you have to make sure that the candidate you're hiring, more than in any other position, is, you know, has the stamp of approval from all the other leaders. It's really, really important that there aren't any things that have been left unsaid, right? And that's why it's also really important that it's not just a gold seal of approval and it's not just here's your job offer, right? It's really important that they are competing and they have to compete against other candidates, or they have to go through the whole process that you still have an application on file, that you still have an interview sheet on file for them, right? Because if you've done that, it gives everyone the voice and the opportunity to say, oh, wait, this is weird. This isn't matching what we said we wanted for this position. And it gives everyone the chance to speak up if there's a larger concern. So I think that's really important. I think generally speaking, you have a few different ways of doing it. If you have a really kind of tight-knit team, a group of leaders who's all been in, and maybe one of them is stepping up and taking on a paid role, um, that can be harder. Some organizations have done that by splitting the role, right? And saying, okay, well, we're doing 4 directors, and each one of our director roles, you are co-leading this organization, but you each have a different piece of the pie that fits your skill set, right? So Station North in particular did that, right? Here are the 4 different directors. You get this one and this one and this one. I think it's also really important that generally starting as a volunteer organization, right? That transition is tricky when you go from all volunteer to paid, right? So generally it's very easy for people to go, oh, well, you're paid, you are, you're the end all be all. The buck stops with you as the paid staff member, right? But you also have to remember that highest paid volunteer, that executive director of any organization, in whatever title you're giving them, they work at will for the board of directors, at least in a nonprofit setting. If I wasn't fulfilling my obligation as an executive director, our board could and should terminate my employment, right? And so I think that's very important that the board knows their role, right? It is their fiduciary responsibility to manage that highest level staff member. That's the only staff member they get kind of daily ops and management, right? They have oversight over that ED. And once you get more staff that are under that executive director or your branch manager, right? The board doesn't get to oversee those people. You as the ED oversee the secondary staff, right? But the board has the responsibility for you. And so I think really making sure those lines of who's in charge of what are really important. You got to make sure that your founders, especially, and this is where we hit like founder syndrome a lot, right? Where founders can't step back from an organization and make space for new people, right? And so a lot of times founders may not take on that first executive director role or that leadership role, but they're still kind of button heads, and it's like, well, who's in charge? Because they haven't been able to step back. So part of it is being aware, if you are one of the founders and the leaders in your organization, about making space for whoever is coming in and supporting them instead of trying to continue to lead. We were very lucky, right? One of our founders, is one of our branch managers currently. The other founder of ours is one of our board members, right? So they both have very active positions. One is paid, one is unpaid, just depending on their roles and who is engaged. One of our founders started out as our first executive director, and it was very clear that those were not his skill sets, right? The admin pieces were not his strong suit. So they said, okay, what do you want to do? And it was, well, you can leave, you could go back, we can give you this different role, right? And that's what we did. He shifted into a different role within our organization. That was still a paid role, but a different role, right? And so he reports to me as the new person coming in. We've been blessed, we've got a great relationship, but it's all about relationship building, I think, when it comes to any role, really. Yeah, good question though. Any other questions?
I'm not going to close down questions, but I did just want to take one quick second to pop up the next slide. The Tool Library Alliance is a shared drive, and we are collecting resources and redistributing resources. If you have anything that seems relevant to this conversation, you are encouraged and welcome to add that or send it to hello@toollibraryalliance.org, and we can add it for you. Kate's added some things. We've got some other members that have added some things. Please feel free to do that.
I mean, you could look at 1,000 different position descriptions, right? I mean, we could spend weeks on staffing and hiring structures. So I tried to kind of target the core pieces, but we do have a bunch of different position descriptions for a variety of those common staff roles. So you can compare, are they full-time? Are they part-time? What's their average rate of salary, right? Like we did not have nearly enough time to get into all of that today. Station North has a great employee handbook, which gives you great examples for like all those core employment policies. And then the staffing resources folder has a smattering of everything else that might be useful, right? So examples of interview questions, different research benefits. So if you want to know more details about like 1099 contracts, there's a great resource in there. If you want to know about doing kind of general orientation and training and some pieces, I tossed in some resources from the Nonprofit Leadership Lab as well. So there's tons and tons and tons of stuff in there. Let's see, other questions. So generally, one question, commission-based grant writer would be problematic. Yeah. So generally in the development world, in the fundraising world, it is a no-go to pay your grant writer a portion of whatever grant they're eligible, like whatever grant comes in, because they need to be paid, generally speaking, on the work they do, not on its results, right? If they're taking the time to write the grant and get it out there and doing all that research, that's what it is. The outcome of the grant is not their compensation should not be tied to the outcome of whether or not you receive that grant, right? Once they've done the work of getting it out there, they've done it. It can be done, but generally it's not encouraged practice. Let's see. So yeah, the $600 threshold is generally the kind of base level for a 1099 or a stipend, at which point you have to start reporting it. And that is that same threshold for volunteers who might be getting additional stipend and kind of a fringe benefit stipend. So there are some tricky ways that people get around that through gift cards and things like that, and non-reporting certain components. But generally speaking, you want to make sure that your compensation package is accurately marked in terms of compensation and reimbursement. The best way to get around components like that is to put whatever kind of bonus fringe benefits that you might think of as a stipend in a reimbursement setting, because then those aren't taxed a second time, generally taxed as compensation. Yes, there are definitely 2 executive directors for some of the tool libraries. There was a duplication in the chart, I think, but there are some libraries who have co-leaders, is the best way to put that. Yes, record retention, security policies, all the really fun stuff that you don't really want to think about or have to necessarily think about as an all-volunteer organization. You have to start to officially manage with paid staff.
Yeah, and I would add so that not the shareable chart, but the chart of our, I think 15 members are included in that data. So from one of our earliest Tool Library Alliance meetings, we kind of had spreadsheets that people filled out. That is viewable if folks want to look at that. And if there's a structure that seems like it makes sense for your library in terms of staffing, might be a good idea to reach out to that specific organization and say, hey, how's this working for you? What are the pain points? What would you do differently?
Yeah, and I know it's always been hard when we've done kind of survey questions around staffing. We haven't gotten really detailed, information. It's just what people provide and what how someone fills that out in terms of like the number of staff, if they're considered part-time or full-time or FT, full-time equivalent, and kind of, you know, how that all adds up is really different. But you know, it is not uncommon for us to see part-time positions that are 5 to 10 hours a week, right? 1 to 2 open hour shifts, if you will, to kind of a lot of half-time positions, and then growing those part-time positions into full-time positions eventually. So personally, I work up to 20 hours a week. And then I have an allotment that I can do an extra 6 hours a month if I need to for accounting, right? Which is like above and beyond my core work. And so that's something you can keep in mind, is that when you're looking at an hourly rate, especially, you might have a range in there, right? So you can definitely build a position where it says, hey, you know, you are guaranteed a minimum of 6 hours a week that, you know, but it could be 6 to 10 or 6 to 15 based on other activities. We do that with our positions. The trick is, right, people's availability, right? And so as you're hiring, do they have extra availability? Do they have extra bandwidth to take on more roles, or to take on that grant funded project, right? Where we go, okay, great, we got this project and we got this grant. Now who will do it? Do you have to hire a, you know, a new person, or can you bookend it and add it on to kind of an existing staff member and go, okay, bonus for the term. And that's what I suggest doing, is bookending it onto another position if it works for your organization, if it is a short-term grant, especially anything that's programmatic, because that's much easier working with someone who already has a connection with your organization and knows kind of the base pieces, and now can add a new project on, than trying to onboard someone in a short term to your organization. And then hope you have additional capacity for them after that funding disappears. Let's see. Yes, fiscal sponsorship is great if you have someone else managing your staffing. That's wonderful. Contracting definitely seems to be the easy way for most, a smaller third-party administrator. I want to say our payroll costs us maybe like $150 a month for our TPA, and they, you know, run everything. They manage everybody's W-2s. They manage all the tax withholding. You know, it's just simple. Basically, I input our hours, and that's that. I input and verify our hours, you know, through an online portal, and they do the rest. I'll just note that I'm also available if you have like a more specific question, or you want to dig into some of like how the tool libraries finagled our individual staffing structure. I figured it was more useful for everybody to have kind of the big picture details than like our individual example. But please feel free to reach out if you'd like to know more about how we've set up our different roles. We do have a team of 5 different staff members who are branch managers, and so they all share the branch manager role with their own kind of open hours pieces. And then myself as a part-time ED. We have got a program coordinator who's about half-time, and then we've got a very, very, very part-time volunteer coordinator too. So that's our newest role. So if anyone like to poke in on any of those, please feel free to reach out.
Kate, can you remind us what your email is?
Certainly, it is kate.hersey@mntools.library.org. Hersey is just like the candy bar without the second H.
Thanks so much for coming.